This is great.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
All right.
Thank
so
you.
I'm gonna go across the room and hopefully you can hear me across the room. All right, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Well, welcome. Sorry about that. We were just talking about how the law and social work intersect. And we had 3 examples. One was in child custody hearings. One was in doing mental health assessments in court. And then the third was advocacy, policy advocacy. Not only advocacy for policy change, but also advocating for the rights of your clients and knowing what policies you're targeting so that they can receive the services that they deserve. Anywhere else where we see the law and social work intersect. Other examples from your practice or your experiences. Feel free to jump in online. I see some familiar names, so it's good to see you online. Anybody else? Yeah.
With like crisis intervention and like the police and
Oh,
bringing them into crisis intervention. Like
yeah, right. So we're going to talk about law enforcement. So it's really interesting, right? When we talk about the courts and the legal system, that we look more broadly, and it's not just what's happening in a judicial arena, but also law enforcement and how social workers intersect with law enforcement in terms of responding to mental health crisis, right? Right, and what's more appropriate in responding to those kinds of situations. Yeah, great examples, great examples. All right, so we'll talk about different ways of how the two intersect. But first I want to start with a conceptual model. Let me now try to, am I sharing my screen? I'm hoping they can see my screen share. So can you see my screen online?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it. All right, let's start with just a conceptual model, right? Of different ways in which law and social work intersect. So has anyone ever heard of these terms? I'm sure some of them are familiar to you. Yes?
Yes.
You're in the audience. Yeah, okay. So therapeutic jurisprudence. What do you think we mean by that? What do you think that is? Therapeutic jurisprudence. That's probably one that's less familiar to you. Well, therapeutic jurisprudence is focused on whether the legal rule or practice has a therapeutic impact on the people that are involved in the process. And you can think of whether it has a therapeutic or even an anti-therapeutic impact on the people who are involved in that system. How does it impact their psychological or physical well-being? Because the law really does that, right? Really impacts how people psychologically experience that situation. So when we talk about law enforcement, we know that there are communities who have a negative therapeutic and anti-therapeutic reaction to law enforcement. So much so that it's really interesting that I was holding a class a couple of years back, and this was when we were in the height of height of the civil unrest that was going on in this country. And I had a social worker say, if I am ever in a situation that calls for a crisis, I will never call the police. I will never call the police, right? Even when there is danger or there's some kind of jeopardy. But that just shows you the impact that that intersection can have on people, where psychologically it's like, that is the last person I'm ever gonna call. Now, as you know, right, if you're social workers and you are in danger in the field, you may need to call law enforcement. But that psychological impact is very real. And if it's real for us, you can imagine what it's like for communities, right? So as social workers, we need to take that into consideration, right? Therapeutic jurisprudence, how are people experiencing that? And there are certain populations that under no circumstances are they going to consider themselves as having a relationship with, right, the law or the legal system. Preventative justice, that's to the extent that social workers work at reducing individuals' involvement in the legal system. How can we do that? How can we as social workers prevent people from getting involved in the legal system in the first place? Taking a more community-wide approach or an advocacy approach of preventative measures to prevent that interaction. Can you think of some examples of how we prevent people from being involved in the legal system? Yeah.
Start with the practice, like climate, what do we have?
Okay, great. Great, that's excellent example. So I don't know if you heard her online.
We
but
did
she
it.
was- She was talking about when you're working with direct practice and you're working with clients, perhaps encouraging them to go into rehab rather than being involved in the court system. So yes, drug courts. The use of drug courts as an alternative to getting involved in this knowledge into the legal system is the way in which preventative justice occurs. Another one goes hand in hand with drug courts. Yeah, in the back.
Now with mental health courts, but I think also just in treatment in general, teaching like distress tolerance skills, like social support, so they're less likely to either interact with the law enforcement to begin with, or like maybe they came to you because they were arrested. How do you prevent that from happening again? Skills.
Yep, you're exactly right. So mental health courts, and then just in your own practice, informing and educating the public how to best interact with this court system for it to react in your best interest, right? But mental health courts, drug courts, even juvenile courts, right? As a way to focus more on rehabilitation rather than punishment in order to reduce the levels of recidivism so that children don't then become adult offenders. So that's a way in which we practice preventative justice. Procedural justice we'll spend a little bit more time on, but what's procedural justice? Is anyone familiar with that? Yeah. Okay, take a guess at it.
Following the constitutional rules, due process, habeas corpus rights, things like that.
Okay, so relate that. So it's following the rules, right? So social workers or who following the rules?
Well, I guess I was referring more to like attorneys and jurists.
Okay.
people,
Okay.
Yeah.
So those are the rules. That's the process. So that's a great start. When you're talking about due process and equal protection, what are the rules of the court, right? To determine how one makes it through the court system. But procedural justice is more about, as people progress through this legal system, do they feel as though the process, the procedures were fair, right? Do I get a fair trial, right? Do I have adequate defense? On the other side, is law enforcement going after the perpetrator vigorously, right? If I'm a victim of court, right? A victim of crime. It's really interesting. I talked about this in my class, talking about the procedure. In the news just recently, there was a case of a woman who was the victim of a sexual assault and had given her DNA to law enforcement in order to find her perpetrator. Anybody hear this case? We talked about it in class. Did anybody hear this case? I believe it was, I want to say it was in California. Years later, it turned out that her DNA was entered into a police data bank, unbeknownst to her, without her consent, and was then used to track her as a criminal. When she committed a crime. Oh, I heard an audible gasp on the online. You want to say anything to that online? No? Okay. So the procedure, how fair is it? Wait a minute. If I'm there, if you're there to protect me, then how does my cooperation with you get then turned back against me? And so it's that whole focus on the procedures. If I don't think it's fair, I'm not going to engage, right? I'm less likely to engage. I'm less likely to trust, right? And as social workers, how do we mediate that? Or at least be aware that that's an issue. So when we're working with communities, we can take it into consideration. Restorative justice. We've all heard about that. Restorative justice is how do we focus on repairing the harms that perhaps a perpetrator has committed and bringing both the perpetrator and the victim together in order for them to make some kind of either remuneration, some kind of monetary remuneration, or a psychological remuneration. And that's restorative justice. And then racial justice, obviously being what we undeniably know is that the legal system is just inherently disproportionately skewed against racial minorities in every step of the process. Procedurally, psychologically, it is skewed against certain segments of the population. That goes hand in hand with what theory? That whole notion of the legal system being inherently biased towards certain segments of the community. What theory does that bring up? Right, critical race theory.
Sure.
We got another audible guest online. You care to say anything? Online? You want to comment to that? So yes, critical race theory takes that into consideration where the legal system is just inherently biased, right? And it even extends beyond that. That's where it was born. And legal circles and it extended beyond that to just all systems in society are just inherently racist in some way. Obviously the subject of much debate, but it is undeniable when you look at the statistics. It's really interesting because whenever I think about the law and how it responds to evidence of disproportionality, it brings up a rather famous Supreme Court case, McCluskey v. Kemp. McCluskey v. Kemp, in which Kemp was a defendant, I believe. So don't quote me. So I'm pulling this out by memory. But I believe the defendant was convicted of murder and was sitting on death row. And he appealed his decision, appealed his conviction. And in appealing his conviction, his attorneys made the argument that he should not be put to death because the death penalty is inherently biased, skewed against Blacks. And that was a major factor. Race was then a major factor in his being on death row. And so if I want to be treated equally, equal protection, if I want to be treated equally, that I should not be put to death simply because I'm Black. And they presented mountains and mountains of evidence to the Supreme Court showing statistically that that occurs over and over again. And the Supreme Court heard that argument and didn't uphold it by saying, well, it may be that the impact of the law is disproportionately skewed, but that was not the intent. And we're here to rule on whether that was the intent of the law rather than the impact of the law. And so there's an implicit understanding or an acceptance that, yeah, we know that it is. We're just not really gonna do anything about it. Like, that's not there. Another audible gasp. I'm hitting a nerve. You care to say anything to that? I appreciate it though. I appreciate it though. It's fascinating when you think about that. The plus you can, but look that case up. But it shows you, again, how serious racial justice is. And as social workers, when we think about all of these forms of justice, this conceptual frame of how our profession intersects with the law, there's a lot of work for us to do, right? It's just a lot of work for us to do. But there are other ways in which we intersect with the law. And that's just simply thinking about your role as a social worker. So it's important to understand that when we collaborate with the legal profession or law enforcement or with the courts, we can do so in a number of areas. We can be a member of a legal team, maybe a small practice and employ social workers to work with their clientele. You might work as an employee of a multi-service agency that provides both services. An example of that would be, and this is in my own career, that I worked with the Legal Aid Society, Juvenile Rights Division. So it employed social workers, and it was somewhat of a social service agency, but it served both. You could be appointed by the court. That role is usually as a social worker, guardian ad litem, or what's the term I'm looking for? When you are an executor of some sort, right? You could be appointed by the court. You could be hired, you could work for the court itself. You can be hired as a consultant or even a mental health professional. So any of those roles you might have as a social worker intersecting with the court. Does anyone have any experience in any of these roles or have additional ones that they can think of in how social workers work within the legal system? Anything online? Yeah.
I worked a little bit in the victim assistance unit of the court and the prosecutor's office. So a lot like accompanying victims and their families to the court hearings that they. Victim impact statement.
Yeah. Great. We'll talk a little bit about that next. So that's great, right? So that's working with a public entity that works hand in hand with the court system and protecting victims' rights, right? I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, my internships at the Public Defender's Office Juvenile Division. And so we work with mainly parents, the social workers, mainly work with parents accused, excuse me, accused of abuse and neglect. And so we help them with their case plans and find resources and just emotionally.
Okay, so child protection. And child protection is very much whenever a child is removed from a home, it's going to set in motion a whole set of legal proceedings here to protect not only the rights of the child, but in your case, the rights of the parents as well. And so working in a defense capacity, protecting the rights of parents, preserving their rights. Yeah.
I worked at a crisis counseling center as well, and then answering for the suicide prevention lifeline. We would advocate for the police officers going to have some kind of training or exposure of mental health and treat them with dignity rather than treating them as a criminal.
So that was a separate, like a nonprofit organization that provided training to police law enforcement.
We would advocate to have that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
I think research, qualitative, as well as quantitative, but can absolutely intersect with and like organizing again, as organizers, I think there's a lot of collaboration that can happen.
Yeah.
with attorneys.
Great example. Yeah.
I also work in crisis services and I think, I mean, social workers can do this. I think there needs to be more of it, is testifying within probate courts for need for treatment. I've seen it mostly be doctors. So not mental health specific, but I think that could be like a really important the best route for treatment for people.
Great. Absolutely. So again, that mental health connection with the legal profession. Anybody online want to respond? In terms of any other ways in which you see that intersection and the kind of roles that social workers play?
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead, Nina.
So I used to be a sexual assault, domestic violence advocate for women helping women. And although I wasn't a social worker technically, I was taking on, some things that social workers do, and I got to interact with social workers at the hospital. But both me and these social workers would interact with police officers that came into the hospital. So sometimes they would kind of prod and poke for more information when they knew that they weren't allowed to do that. So, we had to keep our all of that information, private, obviously, but that was some of the issues we dealt with when it came to dealing with police officers and the law. But yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Good example. Good example. So even if we're not working directly with law enforcement or with members of the legal community, our work bumps up against them. So whatever work that you do, especially if you're in the mental health field, at some point you are going to interact with law enforcement. It's important. Let me back up and say this. As a social worker conducting advocacy, so I love the fact that you keep bringing up advocacy in the back, right? You need to know the law. You need to know policy. You need to know how that impacts the work that we're doing. So you can't escape it. Even if you're not involved in the mental health arena or the substance abuse arena, or you're working with people who have somehow been involved in the legal process. Your work necessitates you to understand this realm of work. So let's talk about a little bit of those roles. So many of you have already brought up the fact that social workers' role is as the victim advocate. And then right under that, I put advocate for the accused. It's really interesting so I think about the scales of justice, right? And you think of balance. As a social worker, we really need to achieve that balance, right? So just as there is advocacy for the accused, there has to be an equal weight for being an advocate for those who are the accusers, right? They deserve services as well. And so one of the things to think about as a social worker, you think about the client populations you serve, how do you achieve that balance? And how do you rid yourself of the bias, right? Or the prejudgments you might make towards one community versus the other? Because when it comes to being involved in the legal system, there's always going to be an equal and compelling individual on the other side, right? That needs our work, needs our level of advocacy just as vigorously as we might advocate for another side, right? So how do you achieve that balance, right? Or at least recognize that balance. There's always two. So as victim advocates, whether that's individual who's the victim of personal violence, intimate personal violence, or child abuse, or any kind of assault, we are there. What role do we play? So we've heard several people talk about just being a mental health support, right? Just being involved and being there to support someone who's working through the process. Again, that focus on the procedural justice to make sure that their needs are being taken care of, because it is very stressful when someone is working their way through the criminal court system. Anybody familiar with CACs? Child Advocacy Centers? Yes, no? Child Advocacy Centers? All right, we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about interviewing. Advocates for the accused. So people who are accused of committing crimes against into procedural justice. And why certain families are being over released or over hurt by the legal system. They have rights as well. They have rights as well. So if we're working with people who have been incarcerated, offenders who are in release programs, or people on probation departments, I think somebody mentioned they work for Department of Probation, that they also have needs that need to be attended to by social workers. Forensic interviewing. What's forensic interviewing? Anybody familiar with forensic interviewing? Your role as a forensic interviewer. Forensic interviewing occurs when there is a victim of crime and that person's testimony needs to be solicited. How do we get that information? And the forensic interviewer is very specific, especially when you're thinking about interviewing children who have been victims of crime and or sexual assault victims. What we don't want to do is have to interview them over and over again. So forensic interviews are usually conducted by child advocacy centers, especially for children, where that interviewer, that child is only interviewed once, but they're only interviewed once in relation to all the other systems that would need that interview, right? So instead of subjecting that child to a child welfare interviewer, and then, oh, now the police needs to interview, oh, now a detective needs to interview, and now the hospital needs to interview this child for more information. Instead of exposing that child over and over again to multiple interviews, a child advocacy center, and these are centers set up nationwide, they coordinate services amongst all of these individuals to do just one interview that serves everyone's purpose, right? But a forensic interview, if you're working in a forensic setting as a social worker, is very different than a regular interview, right? When I say regular, I mean a therapeutic or clinical interview. If you're doing a therapeutic or clinical interview with a child, right? And you're, or any victim of a crime or any kind of abuse, what are some of the presumptions you have in terms of that therapeutic connection? What can you say about how you would approach that interview from a therapeutic perspective when you're interviewing? Anybody online? How would you approach that interview? Go ahead.
I guess one thing is clinically, you don't really care if, you know, they remember every little detail or tell you every little thing they remember. It's more about their perception and how they feel.
Okay, so perception is the reality, right? That you're more concerned about how they perceive the experience rather than the realities, the facts of the situation. Absolutely, go ahead. That's another hand go up. That's an excellent start. Give me another one. Yeah.
I guess we would focus more similar to perception, but caring, treatment, and client-centered rather than the case situation.
Great. So you're more client-centered, you're focused on treatment, right? You're also going to be more validating and accepting of how they perceive their reality. You're going to approach the interview as if what they are saying is true, right? Right? Online?
I think Cindy Miller had her hand raised.
Okay, go ahead online. Oh, I see it. Cindy, go ahead. Are you muted? Hello?
I would say that you do it non-accusingly.
Yeah, great. Yeah, you don't accuse them. So you're accepting the reality as they see it. For sure. Good. What else? How else do we approach clinical interviews?
I was thinking of like directive versus non-directive.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, particularly with a child, you may give them the space and the sort of the control over where the session goes to make them comfortable. But I would assume in a forensic interview that you need to gather certain information. So it has to be directive in that
Yeah.
respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Go ahead.
We also can focus on lived experiences of the patient, because we'll get to know the values and the ethics. As you said, like we we cannot do. So yes, we like non-judgmental and just respect the opinions of the person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Where else? I saw another hand.
More of a question, but is there a time frame where a forensic interview has to be done by?
I would say the sooner the better, usually immediately close to the event, because that's when the details are going to be more fresh. The longer you wait, the more that plays into consideration the veracity of the statement, right? And so if you're dealing with a young child, a month after the event is a long time, right? And so then the details become very fuzzy, which is another point when you're doing a therapeutic interview, right? It doesn't matter the time frame. Whenever you're ready, right? Whenever you're ready, right? That's when we will hold that interview. And if you don't feel like talking now, that's okay, right? So time is not a fact. So you bring up a really great point. Go ahead.
Yeah, just on that, do you have more than one interview? Like how many opportunities to talk with someone do you have before?
In a forensic interview, like how many, so the question is, how many times do you have? Ideally, you would want to do it once, so as not to re-traumatize the individual over and over again. And with a therapeutic interview, they're usually not taped, right? They're not recorded, right? So there's a higher level of protecting the individual's privacy. In a forensic interview, that may not necessarily be the case. You would want it to be videotaped, because that interview then becomes used as evidence in a subsequent trial. You had a question?
How do you initiate therapeutic interview? What are the considerations?
Say the first part again?
How do you initiate the therapeutic interview? Like, what are the considerations for that?
Okay, so the considerations so obviously if you're dealing with a child again, or any victim of assault that you're going to interview, you want to do that on their own terms, whenever they're ready. So therapeutically, you might set the stage and spend a whole lot of time establishing a relationship before someone feels comfortable to share what they need to share. You might talk about other ancillary considerations before they ultimately get to that topic therapeutically. I guess the focus really is on the relationship and what their needs are, and placing yourself in the position of being an advocate for what this client needs therapeutically and from a community standpoint. Conversely, a forensic interview is like flipping it upside down when you think about how we could therapeutically go about working with the client. So the timing is very specific. It's soon after. It's going to be recorded. There is no, to a certain extent, there's not the same level of presumption of confidentiality, because you know that information has to be shared with other members of your legal team. But also, if there is a trial, it's discoverable. So it's going to go to the other side in order for them to form a defense. Luckily, though, CACs work very well in protecting that victim from being re-interviewed, which is why I think victim advocate organizations are so important, because they're going to ensure that that re-victimization doesn't occur over and over again. But also with the forensic interview, whereas we were going clinically thinking, I believe you. What you're telling me is true. A forensic interview is the exact opposite. We go in within a hypothesis testing approach, meaning that we accept a null hypothesis before we even conduct the interview. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? We accept a null hypothesis before we even conduct the interview.
Expect that the crime didn't occur.
Exactly. We go in with the presumption that it did not happen. Right? We go in with the presumption it did not happen. So our brains are a clean slate. We don't believe anything that you're saying, and we focus solely on the facts, what happened, rather than your impression of what happened. Right? Right. And it's not up to me to determine, or for me to insert my own judgments and assumptions about what happened. I am only focused solely on the facts. Whereas therapeutically, right, we accept someone's word as it is. Forensically, we're seeking to establish corroboration. Not only am I going to come in with an approach that's hypothesis testing, that it didn't occur, but what you tell me, I'm going to seek to corroborate to make sure that it is true. Totally different as a social worker working in a forensic environment. You want to stay back there?
No, I had a question. So I know you said the forensic interviews mostly happen with like child advocacy centers, but does that mean it's usually a social worker doing the interview, or would it be like somewhere in law enforcement?
That's a great question. And so child advocacy centers, and here in Ohio, there's a child advocacy center in most counties. I don't know if every single county has one, but many counties do. Cuyahoga County just recently developed theirs. They hadn't had one for a long time. So it's usually a child advocacy center is really a collaboration, an interdisciplinary collaboration between hospitals, law enforcement, mental health practitioners, and the legal system. They all come together, right, and fund the CAC in order to coordinate how a victim of abuse might be treated. Yeah, so it is a partnership. And within that partnership, there might be members, hospital personnel, law enforcement personnel, social workers, mental health practitioners that are all trained specifically on how to conduct a forensic interview. That is really very different than many years ago when I worked in Manhattan Family Court Juvenile Rights Division, that I would conduct forensic interviews. And it was not coordinated. And so that child would have been interviewed maybe a number of times before it got to me as a member of the child's legal team, the GAL. I would interview on her behalf or his behalf. And that child may have already been interviewed by the hospital personnel when they first came in, then by a police officer, and then, right? So things have definitely changed, for sure. Back in the day, we would use anatomically correct doubts. I think that has totally changed now, where we don't use those because they're perceived as being suggestive and leading. So that even saying that, the type of interview, the approach that you take is one that is very objective and very regimented in terms of the types of questions and how you ask those questions. But it is very appropriate for a social worker to fulfill that role. But it really goes counter to our intuitive therapeutic sense of how we work with clients. Other thoughts on that before I go on? Yeah.
Do forensic social workers ever go into a home?
To interview?
Yeah,
Usually the CACs have like a living room space with monitors and cameras. And it's really interesting because CACs are an evidence-based practice model. And so if you go into one CAC in one county or one state, you will see the same structure replicated state by state in terms of what is the best environment and the most sound environment for which to conduct a forensic interview, so as not to re-traumatize the client and to make sure that the information you're soliciting is going to be able to stand up in court against all the evidentiary rules. So it wouldn't happen in a home. Yeah. Yeah, very regimented and structured. Let me see my notes. Is there any other point that I want to make to that? Okay, I think that's it. All right, moving on. You might be called as a court witness. Now, it's interesting being called as a court witness. And I don't know how I'm doing on time. Can I get a time check?
10 to 2, so.
Oh, I gotta wrap up. All right, so let me just say this. We talked about competency evaluators. Whether or not you're doing a mental health examination, that's one role of a social worker, but the other is providing court testimony. As a social worker, you may very well be called to provide testimony in court. That is a skill. That's very much a skill. Either you're going to be summoned or subpoenaed. If you're summoned, there might be rules within your organization that would preclude you from testifying if you're summoned. If you're subpoenaed, that's a order from the court that says you must appeal. You must appeal before a court. So it depends on if you're summoned or subpoenaed. And it's gonna also determine whether or not you're there to give oral testimony or a written report. And when we think about reporting as a social worker, right, that's another area in which it's turned upside down. When we're writing a case notes, we're encouraged to write our impressions, our diagnostic impressions, or not assumptions, I'll say impressions, right? How we would interpret the events, right? What they mean, what the clinical implication of a behavior might be. When you're reporting for the court, it is about the facts, about what you can observe, period. It's not about your impressions. So even your writing, your orientation about how you present information to the court, it's not about your opinions. The only way you would be allowed to give an opinion in court is if you are called as an expert witness, and then you're voir dired as that, and both sides would agree that you have that expertise to offer an opinion. Barring that, it is all about just what you observe. And so your writing is very concise, it's very brief, it's not embellished, focused only on the facts. And it is obviously very timely when you do court reporting, when you have to provide that documentation. But it is very different animal than if you're in a therapeutic environment. Policy advocacy, you talk about that in your policy course. One area in which we see advocacy in the social work's role are consent decrees, especially with vulnerable populations, and that's how we influence public entities to right different wrongs, is through consent decrees. And then the last one is just generally as a forensic social worker. If you are working in a legal setting, that's the type of social work that you're doing as a forensic social worker. And it might involve any or all of those other roles. All right. Drill down a little bit with the forensic interview, and I find that most fascinating, and also in terms of the conceptual framework of how social work and the law intersect. Let me stop there and take any last minute questions because I know I'm way over time. Any other thoughts or impressions? Online? All right, so summing it all up, your knowledge of the law and the legal system is essential to your social work practice, no matter where you work. Being familiar with the structure is really important. And actually, let me just say this. We're coming up for an election. And one of the ways in which I think social workers can influence policy and the law is to be directly involved. And it's so interesting that 2 judges here in Cuyahoga County that are running for judge are alums of this school. It's really interesting. Kevin Kelly is running for a common pleas court, and the other person, can't think of her name. There's one other person, I'm blacking her name. Pamela Hawkins is another judge running. So you never know how you might influence the law. Running for public office is yet another way in which you can do that. So I'm not endorsing anyone, not endorsing, not officially endorsing. There are 2 alums of our school who are running for judge. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Dr. Wilkes, and thank you for stepping in the lead today. And as a follow-up to your comment about social workers getting involved with policy and voting, next week we will have our lunch and learn focused on the post-election debrief and session. So please come next week to our lunch and learn. And if you'd like to have more conversation about policy and the law, we'll be doing some of that as well as a group. Thank you all for coming and have a great day. Take care. Okay.